Dealing with nulls is one of the more interesting and kind of tricky uh, aspects of ETL processing. It's because nulls really don't have a set meaning. In fact, they mean we don't know. So there's a couple things you have to think about when you're going through and designing a ETL process that encounters nulls. And let's take a look at those. One of the things you have to think about with nulls is how they aggregate. Most reports are done based on aggregations of values. So let's say I want to see a list of products and how many items have been sold of those products over time. I'm going to aggregate over time. I should say over products over time. So that's just one example. And often you'll want to go ahead and get something like an average. If you do get an average, you have to think about what's going to happen if there's a null value. For example, let's say that the amount that we sold is 2, 6, and null. Probably 3 different products, or maybe it's the same product and we're just adding those up. If I go ahead and run this, the average is 4. This makes sense because I've got 6 and I've got 2, and then divide that by 2. Or does it? Wait a second. Wouldn't there be 3? Well, there might be, depending on the type of data you're looking at. And certainly, if that were the case, it would be dividing the 8 by 3. Now, which is the correct answer is dependent on what type of calculation you're trying to do. But it just highlights the fact that you do have to think about it. You can't just assume the system's going to do the thinking for you. One way to deal with nulls is just to exclude them. Just say that if it's got a null value, I don't want it. If there's no title ID, there's no title, there's no type, price, or date, I don't want that data. Just leave it out of my reporting database. While this works, it may not be what you really want. Still, it's handy. Another tool that you can use is to transform the data into something else. So for example, if I had a title ID missing for some crazy reason, I could set the value to a -1, indicating that, well, it's missing. Now, my determination that -1 means it's missing is something in my mind. I would have to probably document this someplace for it to make sense. But there are plenty of times where people use numeric values to indicate the status of something. SQL Server indicates things like the status of a default by indicating a value of 0, which is kind of odd, but especially in some cases where the 0 actually indicates things are 100%. It's different, it's odd, but it works. And that's all I'm doing here. I just made up a flag value, some kind of number instead of just a null. Now, this I'm not doing any averaging on because it's the title ID. Nor if I had a title name would I average it. But I might want to convert the null into something like unknown, or title type to unknown instead of just null, because unknown has more meaning to people than null. Null is too ambiguous. I could also do that with title price, setting it to -1. Problem with this, of course, it could mean that, hey, you're supposed to get $1 back every time it's bought. But setting it to 0 indicates that it's free. You can see nulls can be tricky in this regard. Another one is if the publisher date comes in as null, we might set it to some kind of artificial date, a date that might not ever be appropriate. Some data types stop at the first day of 1900, so I might actually use that as the beginning of this unused date. It's just an option, and of course, like many options, they are all dependent on the scenario we're dealing with. But as you can see, the isNull function could be used in a variety of ways. Another way to work with things is to create a lookup table. So a lookup table, or add an additional lookup value. If I made a lookup table with these possible choices, it would actually have a kind of a self-documenting effect, and then I could join to it. Self-documenting by I could have a listing of what these values were and what their intended meaning was. Now, here I'm going to use the dim dates table. I'm going to insert some artificial values to indicate what to do when you find a null value. You see, nulls can be translated into a couple different things. It could be that if somebody gave us a date that was completely blank, we wouldn't know the day, the month, the year, the quarter that the event that we're recording occurred. So in this case, we're probably recording something like a sales event or the date a book was published. We could mark that as being unknown day, or month, quarter, or year. Once again, a little bit easier to read the null, easier to interpret for people that don't deal with databases on a regular basis. Next, it may be that they've given us a value, but it doesn't make any sense. So somebody could give me a value saying that the book was published in 1920, or how about this? How about 1912? And I look at the title and it says Computer Programming in Java. I'm pretty sure that that was not published in 1912. I could actually just go through and say, oh, they must have meant 2012, but that may not be the best idea either. In fact, it may be a better choice just to go ahead and say corrupt day. That's different than we don't know. That means that the data is corrupt. Anyway, I could insert these values into my date table, and they would act as a lookup value. So later on, when I create my other dimensional tables, like the titles table, where I'm looking up a publisher date, if I had some logic that could determine whether or not the publisher date seemed corrupt versus just missing, I could use these newly flagged values to insert data into a table that has data already with an identity column. Now let me scroll up a little bit here. Am I generating the code up here for the insert? Yep, I guess I've missed it. Sorry for the scrolling, guys. I know it's hard in the eyes. Yeah, this, you can't see it here, but the date table, the dim dates table has a column called date key just before this date one. And that column automatically generates a number for you. So if you have this auto number feature turned on, scrolling down, okay, and you want to insert some data, you have to use this option. Set the identity insert option on, then perform your insert, and then turn it back off. I get a lot of questions about that. That's why I had to kind of pause and talk about it. People often try to insert values into a table where they have an identity auto number feature turned on, and it fails. So thought I'd take a second to talk about that. Anyway, once the data was in there, you could go through and cross-reference it like this. Just pull out the date key when you found, so if this date key is, pull out the date and use the date key here. No, I don't think that's what I wanted. So if I had a value here in the date key was unknown, I could go ahead and put a, maybe I had it right before. I could go ahead and put a -1 in there instead. There we go, because I did have it right before. Later on, joining back to the, in a report, I could join back to the date table and present the data with the words like unknown. So nulls indeed can be kind of tricky. They are a useful part of database technology in that they indicate an unknown value, but they also can be used to indicate other things as well, such as we know the value, we just think it's suspect. And in those cases, that might be important for your reports. So you have to kind of take nulls on a case-by-case basis, deciding how you're going to handle them. Hope that makes sense, and I'll see you in the next video where we're going to talk about using the query designer to help you build your ETL code. See you there.